Behind the glitter and twang of Nashville's brightest stars lies a darker rhythm, the sound of bottles clinking long after the music stopped. These weren't just songs about whiskey and heartbreak. For many legends, the addiction was painfully real. They drank to escape fame, loneliness, and their own demons. This is the untold truth of 11 country stars who were drunk every night, the icons who couldn't put the bottle down, even when it nearly destroyed everything. One George Jones, the possum who couldn't put the bottle down. There was no voice like George Jones. The raw ache, the southern drawl, the way he could make pain sound poetic. But behind every heartbreaking ballad was a man who was quietly destroying himself, one bottle at a time. In the 1960s and 70s, when Jones was topping the charts with hits like He Stopped Loving Her Today and The Grand Tour, his drinking was legendary and deadly. He didn't just love whiskey, he was consumed by it. His band members often said that George could drink anyone under the table and then keep singing as if nothing had happened. At first, alcohol was his escape. It dulled the chaos of fame and the loneliness of endless touring. But soon it became his master. Jones's drunken escapades became country folklore, driving a lawnmower 8 miles to the liquor store after his wife hid his car keys, disappearing before shows, slurring through performances that left fans heartbroken. The man who sang about heartbreak was living it in real time, a prisoner to the bottle he couldn't leave behind. His relationship with Tammy Wynette, both musically and personally, was fiery, passionate, and doomed. Together, they created some of country's most beautiful duets, but their marriage was scarred by George's drinking and violent mood swings. Wynette once said that loving George was like loving a hurricane. The man she adored would turn into someone unrecognizable after a few drinks, unpredictable, angry, lost. By the 1980s, Jones had become a symbol of self-destruction. Nashville whispered about him, not the hits, but the hangovers. Yet somehow, through all the wreckage, he never lost his voice. When he finally got sober in the mid-80s, it wasn't fame that saved him, but fear of dying before his story was finished. He clawed his way back from the edge, and his later years became a living redemption story. George Jones died in 2013, having outlived every prophecy of doom. But the scars of his addiction never fully faded. To this day, his legend carries a warning that the greatest voice in country music nearly drank itself silent. His songs remain immortal, but behind every note is a man who once admitted with painful honesty, "I wasn't just drunk, I was gone, too." Hank Williams Sr., the father of country and the prisoner of his own bottle. Before there was Nashville fame or the Grand Ole Opry, there was a skinny boy from Alabama with a guitar and a soul too old for his years. Hank Williams Sr. defined what country music would become: pain, longing, faith, and sin woven into a 3-minute song. But behind every verse of Your Cheatin' Heart and I'm So Lonesome I Could Cry was a man sinking deeper into the darkness of alcohol and despair. Hank's drinking began long before he was famous. He grew up poor, restless, and hurting, dealing with a spinal condition called spina bifida that left him in constant pain. Whiskey dulled that pain, but it also unleashed something uncontrollable inside him. As his fame rose in the late 1940s, his dependence on the bottle grew worse. He would perform flawlessly one night, then miss the next 2 shows, vanishing into days-long benders that left his band scrambling. The Grand Ole Opry, which once embraced him as a prodigy, eventually fired him in 1952 for unreliability. Nashville insiders whispered that Hank was drunk more than he was sober, a truth he never denied. His marriage to Audrey Williams was a battlefield, love, betrayal, and liquor constantly colliding. He was often seen staggering through hotel lobbies, that guitar in one hand, bottle in the other, haunted by the songs he couldn't stop writing. By his late 20s, Hank's life had become a tragic paradox, adored by millions, yet utterly alone. He tried to quit drinking, tried to find solace in religion, but his demons were relentless. Painkillers, morphine, and booze became his only constant companions. His health deteriorated rapidly. His body, ravaged by addiction, began to fail him. On New Year's Day 1953, Hank Williams was found dead in the back seat of his Cadillac on the way to a concert in West Virginia. He was just 29. The autopsy revealed a deadly mix of alcohol and painkillers, a cruel end for the man who gave country music its soul. In the decades since, Hank's legend has only grown. His songs are still played, His voice still echoes through every artist who followed. But behind the legend is a haunting truth. Country's greatest poet was also its first martyr to the bottle. His music taught the world how to feel pain because he lived it every night. 3. Johnny Paycheck, the outlaw who drank his way out of control. Johnny Paycheck wasn't just a singer. He was a symbol of rebellion, danger, and self-destruction. With his wild temper, whiskey-soaked voice, and outlaw attitude, he was everything Nashville both loved and feared. His 1977 anthem, "Take This Job and Shove It," became the working man's battle cry. But behind that defiant grin was a man spiraling deep into addiction, lost between fame and fury. Born Donald Eugene Lytle in Ohio, Paycheck had the raw talent to rival anyone on the scene. He played bass for George Jones before striking out on his own, armed with a voice that could swing from tenderness to rage in a single verse. But even early in his career, the bottle was always there, backstage, on the bus, and in his blood. Friends said he didn't just drink socially, he drank like he had a score to settle with himself. By the time success hit, the money only fed the chaos. Paycheck's tours turned into endless parties. Liquor, pills, and fights were standard fare. He became unpredictable, sometimes showing up drunk to his own shows, other times vanishing entirely. Promoters stopped booking him. Record labels hesitated to touch him. His reputation as a dangerous drunk overshadowed his brilliance as a performer. His downfall reached its peak in 1985, when, during a drunken argument at a bar in Hillsboro, Ohio, he pulled a gun and shot a man in the head. Fortunately, the bullet only grazed the victim. Paycheck was convicted and sentenced to prison. The country outlaw had become a cautionary tale. When reporters asked him what went wrong, his answer was brutally simple: booze and bad judgment. Prison sobered him, literally and spiritually. During his years behind bars, he found faith and swore off drinking. When he was released, he tried to make a comeback, performing gospel and country shows to smaller, quieter crowds. The fire was still there, but the years of abuse had left him fragile, a shadow of his former self. Johnny Paycheck died in 2003, having outlived his outlaw peers but not his regrets. In his final interviews, he spoke often about redemption, not through fame, but through survival. His story remains one of country music's most painful reminders that behind the bravado of the outlaw image often lies a man trying desperately to forget himself at the bottom of a bottle. 4. Tammy Wynette, the first lady of country and the loneliness behind the glass. Tammy Wynette stood on stage with perfect hair, elegant gowns, and a trembling voice that could make the toughest man cry. She was the first lady of country music, the woman who sang "Stand by Your Man." But behind that image of strength and devotion was a fragile soul trapped in a world of pills, whiskey, and unbearable loneliness. Tammy didn't just sing about heartbreak. She lived it in ways the public never truly saw. Born Virginia Wynette Pugh in Mississippi, she grew up poor, working cotton fields before she was even 10. That grit made her unstoppable, but it also carved deep wounds that never fully healed. When her career exploded in the late 1960s, the fame was intoxicating, and so was the pressure. Endless tours, failed marriages, chronic health problems, and the emotional storms of her relationship with George Jones pushed her toward dependence on alcohol and prescription drugs. Her marriage to George was both magical and tragic, two country titans bound by love and destroyed by addiction. Together, they were Nashville royalty, but offstage, their lives unraveled. George's drunken binges often ended in fights and disappearances. Tammy, desperate to cope, began relying on painkillers and, at times, whiskey to numb her anxiety. Those closest to her described nights of tears, pills scattered on dressing tables, and glasses of bourbon she insisted were just to calm the nerves. In the 1970s, Tammy's public image remained untouchable, but privately she was unraveling. The demands of fame and constant health crises, she underwent dozens of surgeries, only deepened her dependence. By the 1990s, the pain had become unbearable, both physical and emotional. Though she had moments of sobriety and resurgence, her body had already paid the price for decades of abuse. Tammy Wynette died in 1998 at just 55 years old. The cause? Heart failure linked to chronic health issues and years of heavy medication. Some say alcohol never fully left the equation. Nashville mourned her as a legend, but those who knew her best understood the deeper tragedy. that the woman who taught millions to stand by your man never found someone who could truly stand by her. Her voice remains eternal, a haunting echo of love and loss. But her life stands as a painful reminder. Even the brightest stars can fade behind the glow of a whiskey glass and the silence of an empty room. 5. Keith Whitley, the voice that drowned in whiskey. Keith Whitley had a voice that could stop time, smooth, sorrowful, and pure country. When he sang, it felt like he was confessing directly to your soul. But behind that velvet voice was a young man quietly drinking himself to death, long before the world realized how special he truly was. His story isn't just about addiction. It's about how quickly Nashville's brightest flame can burn out when the bottle becomes the only friend that listens. Born in Sandy Hook, Kentucky, Whitley was performing by the time he was a teenager. His talent was unmistakable, his tone hauntingly honest. When he joined Ralph Stanley's bluegrass band, he seemed destined for greatness. But even then, alcohol was already his shadow. Friends recalled a teenage Keith drinking heavily before shows, often to calm his nerves. As his career advanced, so did his dependency, and his tolerance for whiskey became legendary. By the mid-1980s, Whitley was poised to become country's next great traditionalist. Hits like Don't Close Your Eyes, When You Say Nothing at All, and I'm No Stranger to the Rain made him a star. Yet while the industry celebrated his success, those close to him knew he was falling apart. He could deliver a flawless performance one night and drink himself unconscious the next. His wife, singer Lori Morgan, tried to save him, pouring out bottles, hiding car keys, pleading for him to stop. But addiction had already wrapped its hands around his genius. Producers and bandmates recalled how alcohol would transform him. Offstage, he was kind, humble, and shy. After a few drinks, though, he became reckless, emotional, and self-destructive. He often confessed that he feared success as much as failure, and the bottle was his escape from both. "I don't drink for fun," he once told a friend. "I drink to forget I'm still here." On May 9th, 1989, Keith Whitley was found dead at his home at just 33 years old. The cause? Alcohol poisoning. His blood alcohol content was 0.47, nearly 6 times the legal limit. The loss shook Nashville to its core. He wasn't a washed-up star or a fading voice. He was at the height of his career, about to become a legend. Today, Whitley's music lives on, often cited by artists like Garth Brooks and Chris Young as inspiration. But every time his songs play, there's a shadow behind the melody. The ghost of a man who had everything to live for, but couldn't stop drinking long enough to realize it. 6. Waylon Jennings, whiskey, cocaine, and the outlaw who almost didn't survive. Waylon Jennings wasn't just a country singer. He was a movement. The outlaw spirit of the 1970s was born from his defiance of Nashville's polished machine. He fought for creative control, tore down industry rules, and lived on his own terms. But behind that fearless image was a man enslaved by his addictions, first to amphetamines, then cocaine, and always to whiskey. His growling voice and leathered look hit a slow, painful battle between rebellion and self-destruction. Born in Littlefield, Texas, Jennings started out as a protege of Buddy Holly and even gave up his airplane seat to another musician on the flight that would crash and kill Holly, Ritchie Valens, and the Big Bopper. That twist of fate haunted him for decades. Survivor's guilt drove him harder, faster, and deeper into the reckless life of a touring musician. Whiskey became his comfort, cocaine his fuel. By the 1970s, he was one of the biggest stars in country music and one of the most intoxicated. During his peak, Jennings was consuming cocaine daily and washing it down with liquor. He'd stay awake for days recording albums, running purely on adrenaline and chemicals. Friends and collaborators like Willie Nelson and Chris Christopherson admired his genius, but feared his collapse. His marriage to Jessie Coulter endured it all. The mood swings, the rage, the nights he didn't come home. She once said, "You couldn't tell Waylon what to do. You just had to love him through it." The outlaw image sold records, but it also killed the man behind it. In the early 80s, Waylon's health began to deteriorate. His weight ballooned, his heart strained, and the drugs and alcohol started taking more than they gave. In 1984, after nearly losing everything, he finally went cold turkey. He locked himself away for weeks, sweating through withdrawal, refusing to go to rehab. When he came out, he was sober and alive against all odds. Sobriety brought clarity, but also regret. He admitted later that he had spent over $2 million on cocaine and lost countless years to the haze. The outlaw thing, he said, was supposed to mean freedom, but I was a slave. Waylon Jennings died in 2002 from complications of diabetes, long after he'd conquered his demons. He left behind a musical legacy that reshaped country forever. Raw, honest, unapologetic. Yet behind that legend remains the hard truth. The man who helped country music find its soul almost lost his own to the bottle and the needle. 7. Merle Haggard, whiskey, regret, and the poet of the common man. Merle Haggard lived a life that seemed straight out of one of his own songs. Prison, heartbreak, redemption, and the endless tug of addiction. He was the poet of the working class, the voice of the forgotten, and one of the few country legends who truly earned the word outlaw. But for all his success, fame couldn't quiet the ghost that haunted him, and like so many of his peers, he found both comfort and destruction at the bottom of a bottle. Born in a converted boxcar in Bakersfield, California, Haggard's early life was shaped by hardship. His father's death when Merle was 9 sent him spiraling into rebellion, theft, truancy, and a string of arrests that led him to San Quentin prison by age 20. It was there that he saw Johnny Cash perform live, a moment that changed his life. Haggard vowed to straighten out, and he did. He came out of prison determined to make music that told the truth. By the late 1960s, he was one of country's biggest stars. Songs like Mama Tried, Sing Me Back Home, and The Bottle Let Me Down made him a legend. But the irony of that last title wasn't lost on him. Haggard was drinking heavily, often to numb the pressure of fame and the pain of his past. On stage, he was magnetic. Off stage, he was restless, anxious, and often drunk. Bandmates recalled nights when he'd down entire bottles of whiskey before walking out to perform. His voice somehow still golden, even when his hands trembled. His drinking was both a shield and a wound. It softened the edges of his loneliness, but deepened the cracks in his relationships. His marriages, 5 in total, suffered under the strain of his addiction and volatile temper. He was candid about his struggles, once admitting, "I drank to keep the demons away, but all it did was feed them." By the 1980s, Haggard's health was faltering. Years of alcohol abuse had taken a toll on his liver, and he was forced to confront his mortality. Slowly, he began to pull away from the bottle, finding stability in his later marriage and a renewed love for songwriting. Sobriety didn't erase the past, but it allowed him to reflect on it with brutal honesty. Merle Haggard passed away in 2016 on his 79th birthday. Poetic to the end. He left behind a body of work that captured America's soul, but also a warning about the cost of drowning pain in whiskey. He once said, "Every drink I took was just me trying to forget that little boy in the boxcar." In the end, that little boy never left him. He just learned to sing his sorrow into something eternal. 8. Hank Williams Jr., living in his father's shadow and drowning his pain. Being the son of a legend is both a blessing and a curse, and no one knew that better than Hank Williams Jr. From the day he picked up a guitar, the world expected him to be his father reborn. He inherited Hank Sr.'s name, talent, and charisma, but also the dark pull of whiskey and self-destruction. Behind the loud guitars, rowdy songs, and rebel persona, Hank Jr. fought his own war with alcohol, fame, and identity. As a teenager, he was thrust onto stages he wasn't ready for, forced to perform his father's songs before he even had the chance to find his own voice. Fans adored him, but he felt trapped, a ghost of a man he never truly knew. The pressure broke him, and in the early 1970s, he began drinking heavily to cope. Whiskey dulled the pain of comparison, but it also fueled a dangerous spiral. Hank once said, "I didn't want to be Hank Williams' son. I wanted to be me." But nobody wanted that. Then came the accident. In 1975, during a hiking trip in Montana, Hank Jr. fell over 500 feet down a mountain. His skull was shattered, his face destroyed. Doctors doubted he'd survive, but somehow he did. Rebuilt, scarred, and unrecognizable. The near-death experience changed him forever. When he returned to music, he left behind the ghost of Hank Sr. and embraced his own identity, the defiant, whiskey-drinking outlaw who sang songs like Whiskey Bent and Hellbound and Family Tradition. The transformation made him a superstar, but the pain didn't go away. His addiction deepened. Whiskey and cocaine fueled his nights, and his temper often matched the chaos of his lifestyle. Friends described wild parties that lasted for days, arguments that ended in violence, and binges that left him broken. The tragedy of living up to his father's name had evolved into a different curse: living too fast to escape it. By the 1990s, after decades of touring and substance abuse, Hank Jr. began to pull back. The deaths of close friends, including Waylon Jennings, forced him to reevaluate his life. Slowly, he began the long road toward sobriety, though he never claimed to be fully cured. He learned to balance the wild man image with a quiet kind of wisdom, the kind that only comes after surviving yourself. Today, Hank Williams Jr. stands as a bridge between generations, the son who carried the torch, stumbled under its weight, and somehow kept the flame alive. His story is a reminder that legacy can be as heavy as addiction, and that sometimes the hardest thing to survive isn't the bottle, it's your own name. 9. Tanya Tucker, the rebel queen who nearly lost herself to the bottle. Tanya Tucker was born to be a star, bold, fearless, and unashamedly rebellious. At just 13, she broke into country music with Delta Dawn, her smoky voice and defiant swagger defying every expectation of a teenage girl. But fame came too fast, too young, and with it came the chaos of adulthood, broken hearts, public scandals, and a lifelong struggle with alcohol that almost consumed her before she even turned 30. Growing up in Texas, Tanya was surrounded by music and ambition. Her parents pushed her career hard, and by her mid-teens, she was touring, recording, and living in a world of adults twice her age. The industry celebrated her, but it also devoured her innocence. The pressure to perform, the loneliness of constant travel, and the gossip swirling around her every move led her to the same place so many country stars had gone before: the bottle. By her 20s, Tanya had transformed from child prodigy into a full-fledged country icon, but one living dangerously on the edge. Her relationships with stars like Glenn Campbell were as volatile as they were passionate, fueled by drinking and jealousy. The tabloids followed every fight, every party, every breakdown. She once said in an interview, "I started drinking to take the edge off. Then I drank because I couldn't face the next morning." Alcohol soon became both her shield and her prison. Her career faltered as her reputation for wildness grew. She would miss shows, slur through interviews, or disappear for days. Nashville whispered that Tanya Tucker was over before she was 30. But what they didn't know was that she was still fighting, and she wasn't ready to be a casualty of fame. In the 1980s and 90s, after years of hard living, Tanya decided to reclaim her life. She checked into rehab, got sober, and returned to music with a vengeance. Her voice, rawer, deeper, and wiser, carried the scars of everything she'd survived. Songs like Two Sparrows in a Hurricane reflected a woman who'd seen the worst of herself and come out stronger. Though she's had relapses and battles along the way, Tanya Tucker remains one of country's most enduring figures. She never hid her past or sugarcoated her mistakes, and that honesty became her redemption. Today, she stands as proof that survival isn't about being perfect. It's about facing the demons, one sober sunrise at a time. Her story is the rare one in Nashville that ends not in tragedy, but in triumph. The girl who grew up too fast, fell too far, and somehow found her way back, bottle in hand. 10. Allan Coe, Whiskey, Rage, and the Man Too Wild for Nashville. Allan Coe has always been country music's most dangerous outlaw, a man whose life blurred the line between myth and madness. He sang of whiskey, prisons, and broken hearts with a voice soaked in rebellion. But his battles weren't just with record labels or authority. They were with himself. Behind his provocative songs and defiant persona lay decades of self-destruction, fueled by alcohol, ego, and a refusal to bow to anyone. Born in Akron, Ohio, Coe's story reads like a Southern Gothic novel. He spent much of his youth in reform schools and prisons, where violence and hard living hardened him long before fame ever found him. When he finally broke through in the 1970s with hits like The Ride and You Never Even Called Me By My Name, he was already a legend among outlaws, a man too rough, too raw, and too unpredictable for Nashville's clean-cut image. Alcohol was always part of his act, and part of his undoing. Fans loved the chaos, the sense that any night could explode into something wild and unforgettable. But behind the scenes, Coe's drinking was constant and corrosive. Bandmates described marathon binges, hotel room brawls, and shows that ended in shouting matches or blackouts. His reputation for volatility, often under the influence, cost him friendships, recording deals, and respect from the very scene he helped define. Unlike other country drinkers who masked their pain and sorrow, Coe wore his demons like badges. He saw the bottle as fuel, for courage, for anger, for creativity. But that defiance had a cost. His career became a pattern of brief resurgences, followed by collapses, his voice growing rougher and his performances more erratic. Nashville quietly distanced itself, branding him too unstable, too offensive, too dangerous. By the late 1990s, years of hard drinking and a lifetime of excess began to catch up with him. Financial struggles, failed marriages, and legal issues left him nearly broken. Yet somehow, Coe refused to disappear. He sobered up sporadically, released independent albums, and kept performing, even when his body could barely keep up with his legend. David Allan Coe's story is not one of redemption in the traditional sense. He never fully escaped the bottle. He simply learned to coexist with his vices. But his legacy, wild and unfiltered, remains etched into the DNA of outlaw country. He once said, "You can't sing about whiskey if you ain't lived it." And live it he did. Every drop, every bruise, every heartbreak poured into the music that still echoes through America's dive bars and backroads. 11. George Strait, the quiet king who faced his pain in silence. George Strait is known as the king of country, polished, disciplined, and seemingly untouched by the scandals that plagued so many of his peers. His smooth voice, clean image, and timeless songs made him a Nashville institution. But behind the calm demeanor and cowboy hat was a man who endured unimaginable loss, loneliness, and private battles that could have easily driven him to the same self-destructive path others never escaped. For George, the struggle wasn't public. It was quiet, hidden behind a glass of whiskey and an unwavering poker face. Born in Petite, Texas, Strait embodied the spirit of traditional country. He didn't chase trends or drama. He just made music that spoke to ordinary people. But in 1986, tragedy struck when his 13-year-old daughter, Jennifer, was killed in a car accident. The loss devastated him. Close friends recall how George, normally stoic and reserved, withdrew completely. He stopped doing interviews, rarely spoke about the tragedy, and spent years burying himself in touring and songwriting. Whiskey became his silent companion. Unlike many country stars who spiraled publicly, Strait's drinking was subtle, a slow numbing of grief that few outside his inner circle ever saw. Band members have quietly mentioned his heavy late-night drinking during tours in the late 80s and early 90s, a coping mechanism that threatened to consume his famously controlled life. But even in those darkest years, he never allowed the bottle to define him. Instead, Strait turned his pain inward, into discipline, into music. His songs from that era, Baby Blue, You Look So Good in Love, The Chair, carried a new weight, a melancholy that only those who had truly suffered could express. He sang about heartbreak and loss, not as a storyteller, but as a survivor. Every lyric felt like a quiet confession. Through sheer willpower and faith, Strait managed what few country legends ever did. He stopped before it destroyed him. He didn't check into rehab or make headlines for breakdowns. He simply made a choice: to live for the daughter he lost, for his family, and for the fans who saw in him the best of what country music could be. George Strait never pretended to be perfect. He once said, "Everyone has their demons. Mine just wear a cowboy hat." His story stands apart not because he avoided tragedy, but because he faced it with quiet resilience instead of chaos. In a genre filled with outlaws and broken souls, George Strait remains the rare king who walked through the same darkness, whiskey in hand, grief in heart, and somehow found his way back into the light without ever letting the world see him fall. 12. Johnny Cash, the man in black and the bottle that nearly broke him. Johnny Cash wasn't just a country legend. He was a myth, a prophet, and a sinner all in one. Dressed in black, his voice carried the weight of prison bars, heartbreak, and redemption. But before he became a symbol of hope and survival, Cash was a man utterly consumed by addiction, not just to pills, but to whiskey, chaos, and the darkness that haunted his soul. His story is proof that even saints of country music can stumble through hell before finding grace. Born in 1932 in Arkansas, Cash grew up during the Great Depression, surrounded by poverty and gospel hymns. The tragedy that marked his youth, the death of his beloved brother Jack, shaped his lifelong guilt and melancholy. When fame found him in the 1950s, with hits like I Walk the Line and Folsom Prison Blues, the young man who sang about morality was already living on the edge of self-destruction. Endless touring, sleepless nights, and the crushing pressure to deliver led him straight to the bottle and a cocktail of amphetamines, barbiturates, and whiskey that nearly killed him. By the early 1960s, Cash was a ghost of himself. He would disappear for days, wreck hotel rooms, and show up to performances so intoxicated that he forgot the lyrics to his own songs. His marriage to Vivian Liberto collapsed under the weight of his addictions. Even his bandmates admitted that touring with him was a rolling disaster. He crashed cars, destroyed relationships, and one infamous night in 1965 set fire to a California forest while drunk and high, killing dozens of condors, a literal blaze of self-destruction. And yet, from the ashes, something extraordinary happened. At his lowest point, when even the Grand Ole Opry had banned him, Cash found salvation, not in fame or music, but in faith and love. June Carter, the woman who would become his wife, refused to give up on him. She helped him get clean, stay alive, and rebuild his spirit. Together, they became the heart of a new kind of country, raw, redemptive, and painfully human. By the 1970s, Johnny Cash had reclaimed his soul, performing for prisoners, presidents, and people who saw their own darkness reflected in his. His black clothes were no gimmick. They were a vow to remember the broken, the addicted, and the forgotten. I wear the black for the poor and the beaten down, he said, for the prisoner who has long paid for his crime, and for the man who never came back. Cash died in 2003, 4 months after June, but his legacy is eternal. His music still trembles with truth, that redemption is never out of reach, even for those who have fallen furthest. Behind every hymn, every confession, and every glass of whiskey, there was always the man in black, forever walking the line between sin and salvation.